Okay, folks, let's speak more about Canada and how Western economies are fragmenting. Trump hasn't taken office yet, but he's already causing havoc in the North. We just discussed how Trudeau's government is in a panic state. The new tariff has left Canada tremendously exposed and vulnerable. Nearly 80% of Canada's exports go to the United States. A tariff war might eliminate a large portion of commerce, particularly items with razor-thin margins here. This graphic reveals which sectors are most vulnerable to a Trump trade war. Machinery and transportation, 26% to the United States. Mineral fuels account for 85%. Chemicals account for 75%, while manufactured products account for 61%. More than $400 billion in commerce is at danger here. And, as previously said, Canada's trade links with other nations, such as China and the EU, are insufficiently developed. So Trump is coming in like a wrecking ball. His tax might result in a significant flight of key industries. Similar to the case in Germany, large equipment and car manufacturers may be pushed to migrate to the United States. But there is another issue with the trade fight. Canada earns a lot of money from its commerce with the United States, which accounts for 80% of its exports. If it dries up, Trudeau will face a currency crisis. There will be an economic emergency. Historically, the Canadian dollar, or the loonie, was strong against the reserve currency. It even exceeded parity over $1 at one point. However, as the U.S. economy expanded and became more self-sufficient, the value of the loonie plummeted. So picture what would happen if Canadian goods ceased coming into the United States. The flow of U.S. funds into Canada would likewise stop up. Even if exporters could sell abroad, profits would plummet. You will still face a persistent money deficit. Imports would now be far more expensive. Canada's largest imports, such as automobiles and auto components, will become more expensive. This, in turn, would crush their industrial sector even more. So it's a single doom loop spiral. This is the expense of relying on a single trading partner for everything. That could have worked during Biden's administration. But what about Trump? Well, he's going to smash everything to bits. And it only got worse. Canada's finance minister just threw the letter and resigned. So, in addition to the financial crisis, there is also a political issue. She disagrees with Trudeau's approach and is urging Canada to keep its budgetary powder dry. This is an essential statement. Canada is in a budgetary catastrophe, and they will need to deficit spend their way out of it by 2025. It is crucial that we study Freeland's resignation letter because it indicates that Canada is rapidly reaching a catastrophe. And here are the key points. Keeping our fiscal powder dry today to ensure we have the reserves required for a potential trade war. This entails fighting back against America's first economic nationalism in order to secure capital, investment, and the employment that come with it. So Freeland is aware that Trump intends to return global companies to American soil, and the United States is using the size of its consumer market and the U.S. currency to accomplish this. Canada's debt burden isn't that ridiculous yet. Their debt-to-GDP ratio is roughly 50%, which is less than half compared to the United States. In addition, by 2025, Canada's deficit will be less than $50 billion, or 1.6% of GDP. However, the issue here is the direction of the deficit. If a trade war occurs, Canada will be forced to borrow and spend more money in the economy. Trudeau would have to provide more subsidies or run a far higher deficit. Neither is advantageous for Canada in the long run. We can instantly observe the harm done to the Canadian bond market. Yields are surging higher. The currency also plunged to a 4-year low versus the US dollar. Trudeau intends to impose an export levy on commodities such as oil into the United States. However, if the United States obtains its supply elsewhere, Canada will experience an oil glut or oversupply, lowering energy prices and causing oil producers to suffer greatly. However, the remedy is actually fairly straightforward. If the United States adopts protectionist policies, Canada should expand commerce with the BRICS countries. They must rebuild good relations with China. It may be a difficult pill to take, but alternatives are running short. And while we've seen this graphic before, it bears repeating. It seems apparent that the BRICS will lead the world's economic growth. The international average is around 3.2%. All of the G7 economies' growth rates are lower than that, particularly in Europe, where it is just 1%. But take a look at BRICS, with India at 6.8% and China at 4.6%. And with growth comes increased consumption. As the United States moves toward protectionism, the only rational response is to globalize your economy. That involves attracting foreign investment and exporting to more places outside of the West. So there is a way out of this trap, but it all rests on Canada's willingness to collaborate with the BRICS. Because when you do, positive things seem to happen, which leads us to the current situation in Europe. By now, it is clear that the EU is facing a period of economic stagnation. And here's how horrible it is. The EU economy will increase by only 0.9% each year until 2039. And that's 15 years of terrible growth. The energy equation is still not solved. The conflict with Russia might endure much longer. When you add in a trade war from the United States, Europe is effectively cornered. And Spain is beginning to question the EU trend, looking for a way out. Spain was one of the few countries that rejected China's electric vehicle tariffs. And now, the Chinese conglomerate CATL is constructing a battery manufacturing in the nation. And this is a joint venture with Stellantis for a €4 billion EU factory. There's a lot of money involved, and this is a step towards Europe producing its own batteries. This makes a lot of sense for China. Spain will utilize money from the EU Recovery Fund to create this structure, which is worth more than €700 billion. In addition, Spain boasts the world's greatest automobile manufacturing rate per employee. In other words, Spanish auto workers are extremely prolific. If this trend continues, Spain may overtake Germany in terms of market share. So we are seeing a difference in fortunes inside Europe itself. And more crucially, how Chinese enterprises are expanding into Europe. Now contrast this with what is occurring in Germany. Companies are departing, and consumption is plummeting rapidly. The finance minister has been dismissed as Schulz struggles to remain afloat. In a disturbing study, it appears there is no way out. Germany is unraveling. High energy costs and declining exports have reduced German family income by €2,500. After 5 years of stagnation, Germany's GDP is 5% less than before the epidemic. The drivers of a strong German economy have become significant disadvantages, and 3 of the 4 drivers are becoming worse. High energy prices have slowed growth. Global demand for German products is falling year after year. Domestic demand has also gone from stagnant to negative. In fact, they'll probably want to restart the Russian gas supply. And now it's all about survival. But let's speak about Canada's trade conflict with the United States. The private sector, like the US economy, is not doing well. The trade battle will only hurt private enterprises much more. Canada's unemployment rate has risen to 6.8%. Unemployment is at its highest level in 3 years. And get this, out of the 51,000 new jobs generated, 90% were in the public sector. In other words, government positions. The scenario is the same as in past U.S. job reports. The private sector is struggling, and unemployment should be greater if it weren't for government jobs. Now, when I initially saw the figures, I couldn't believe it, right? Something is clearly broken with the system. And this is another indication of a worldwide downturn. Unemployment is rising to 8%, approaching the 2020 lockdown levels. Then there's young unemployment, which is rapidly approaching 14%. Let us not ignore wage growth. It fell to 3.9% in November, much below all projections. So the problem will only become worse. The value of the loonie is falling, causing significant inflation to increase. Lowering interest rates now to stabilize the economy risks triggering a worse inflation catastrophe. And without free land, it will be far more difficult to oppose Trump's trade war. In a resignation letter, Freeland stated that Canada must end political tricks. The government, for example, provided a 2-month sales tax vacation for things such as toys and Christmas trees. That is a political gimmick. They also issued $250 checks to millions of Canadians. You may call that a gimmick as well, but it does not address the core problem. The exposure to the U.S. economy is simply too high. If the United States sneezes, Canada will acquire a cold. There is no way around it. And given all of this evidence, it appears that Canada will be forced to relent sooner or later. If necessary, this might result in higher deficits and lower interest rates. So you have yet another large economy on the verge of relaxing, which puts more pressure on the Canadian currency. The currency has fallen by more than 7% year to date, and this trend is expected to worsen once Trump takes office in 2025. Long term, it is clear that Canada must diversify its trade to sustain currency strength. But it doesn't surprise me if Canada is obliged to sell its treasury assets to save the loonie. They have roughly $400 billion in U.S. bonds as reserves, so they have the firepower to defend the currency. Of course, selling this would send a negative message to the U.S., so that doesn't look good. Trump hasn't taken office yet, but he's already wreaking havoc with the possibility of a trade war. But tell me what you think. Does Canada have any bargaining leverage at all? And which EU country will be the next to break ranks? Please let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to like and subscribe as we navigate these tumultuous times.